Well, hey, y'all. It's so happy to be back here in Long Island. I'm still planning on stealing your building, just so you know. I love this space. I love everything about it. I love the gardens. I love the grounds. I love the people. I remember going to your office at Yeshiva University. I remember working in workshops with you for many, many years. I remember dancing on a mountaintop with you and Judy, and you've got great folks here. And it's always a pleasure to come back to this society. That was a very powerful song from Michael Jackson, and it kind of reminds me, like here we are on I guess, Easter. As an environmentalist, I sometimes think that those who do not consider the rest of being as part of our plan for salvation are fast becoming irrelevant. And that what we really need to do is to think about the impact that we're having on our planet more and more and what we can do. I am coming here as someone who's been involved both with the ethical culture movement for many, many, many years, ever since I helped found the Austin Society and do those work in Texas, but also just because I have worked as an environmentalist for so many years, which helped shape my ideas and my understanding. And I had the benefit of working with some pretty brilliant environmentalists over the years and community activists and community organizers. And after doing that for 15 years, it reminded me that I needed to come back into ethical culture for reasons I'm about to give you. What I'm going to do is something completely different than probably used to. I'm going to kind of quickly run through what it means to be an ethical biocentrist, why I call myself that. I don't call myself a humanist. I haven't for many, many, many years. But why biocentrism is such an important thing to me and how that kind of gotten started. And because I want to have a conversation with lots of ethical societies about bringing more biocentrism into your movement, into your congregations as well, as I've been trying to do at the Bergen Society since I started there in May. And we're doing very well with the Bergen Society. Things are moving along pretty well. And luckily, and I'll kind of be talking about that a little bit later on, but I'm going to have to frame this conversation. We in the United States have very interesting conversations around environmentalism and ecosystems, which have been kind of rarefied in some respects about the things that we pay attention to and the things we don't pay attention to. And you know, usually people say, well, you know, I recycle at home and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, well, good for you. That's great, do that. But that's really, I'm thinking of something a little bit bigger and broader beyond that as well. I'm going to kind of present this in a couple of different parts and then about how I think about ethical philosophy in terms of the environment. And I am pretty much an Adlerian, I would say probably extremely follower of Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical culture movement, and kind of how he viewed the nature of reality based on what he understood being a 23-year-old man when he founded this movement. Think of that, put that into perspective. But before I talk about Adler, I want to talk about Aldo Leopold, about the word biocentrism. Aldo Leopold was a conservationist and a professor of forestry. He wrote several kind of famous books, among them Sand County Almanac. Has anyone read the book? Yeah, one person, yay. Yeah, highly recommend it, in which he lays out one chapter in that called The Land Ethic. And what Aldo Leopold was caretaking of a forest in New Mexico when he was a younger man and shot one of the last wolves in an area that's now called the Aldo Leopold Wilderness. And as the wolf died, he thought he was doing something better for nature, but as the wolf died, he could see in the green eyes of the wolf that perhaps the mountain and the wolf had a different opinion. And it shaped him so much that he eventually spent his time in Wisconsin in a cabin, wrote his own book called A Sand County Almanac, in which he says that what we need to think about as humans is not us as the center of the ecosystem, like an anthropocentric type of view of the world, but as a biocentric, as humans as part of the natural environment and things around us as well. And so in that book, though, he says one of the main problems is we have an environment that we're rapidly destroying. This is in the 1940s when he wrote this book. He says, look at all the horrible things we've done to the earth in the 1940s, the loss of topsoil, the fact that the carrier pigeon, which once blanketed the skies in the United States, was shot and killed until they're now extinct, and all these things that have happened to our planet. And he says, the problem is that we don't have an ethics to stop any of that. That's what he says in his book. We have a toothless ethics. People don't feel enough shame, as Arthur used to tell me, that one of the things we should maybe bring back a little bit more is some shame. We don't have any guilt around it. We have an ethics that cannot change people to do anything. And that's the problem with ethics. And in that book, A Sand County Almanac, he said we need a new ethics. And he says it has something to do with the fact that we're going to preserve the ecosystem, but he was not an ethicist, and he stopped there. I found the book intriguing, and have ever wondered what would an ethics be like that kind of changed us and had an influence on us. And since that time, for the last 20 years, have been researching what an ethic would look like that did such a thing. The problem we have is Marvin Harris. Has anyone ever read any of Marvin Harris's book? Just like to find out. Marvin Harris was a guy who studied kind of how ethical systems evolved. And he said that if you go back in time, there are really kind of three structures that really govern human society. First is what we call the infrastructure. We had to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, take care of ourselves. We had resources out there. We had demographics. We had a population. And we had to bring in food and feed and take care and clothe and do everything that we possibly could to provide for all of us. Eventually, as we got bigger and this system got more complex, we realized that we needed then not only an infrastructure for bringing in food and housing and energy and all these things, we needed a social structure to kind of govern that, create laws, create rules, decide even on warfare with other people who may be trying to take our resources and stuff like that. And he said at the highest level above that, or at the top of that, was something called the superstructure. We then created ethical and moral systems to justify everything that was below that. This is the reason why we do that. This is our religious beliefs say that this is why this is important and why what other people are doing is not ethical anymore, because it really gets shaped so much by the infrastructure. By the superstructure. And so he said the problem is we keep trying to use the superstructure, which is where ethics are, to change how we do the infrastructure. We shake our heads and wag our fingers all the time and saying our whole system of economy and the way that we extract resources and all the ways that we do that, we should stop that. But really, we're talking at the wrong level. We're talking at the level of ethics, at the top, and religions, and instead of going back just to look at how we use the infrastructure itself. How do we kind of use our economy, and what kind of efforts do we need to change there? As an environmentalist, one of the things I work with youth all the time, still to this day, run youth core programs, summer youth employment programs, which I did for many, many years. I hope to eventually have this society develop its own youth core. I will show you how to do that, where all the money is to do that. You can hire people for summer youth employment programs to do that kind of work. There's more money right now in the system to do that than ever before in the history of the United States, and progressive liberal groups are not taking advantage of it. But part of what I wanted to do is people say, do you ever talk to kids about climate change and all these things and the ethics of our system, all that stuff? And I say, absolutely not. I don't ever talk about those things. Instead, what I do is I help create jobs for young adults in the ecology, in the environment, make sure that there are additional jobs and innovation and all the great change that they're going to have to do. Our youth are going to have to change our economy worldwide, and especially here in the United States, in order to mitigate against climate change. And so that's where I put all my effort into right there. So if we believe Marvin Harris, and not 100% in agreement with this philosophy, but the idea is that we have this huge infrastructure of how we get energy, food, clothing, all that stuff. I was standing at a bagel shop this morning getting a bagel and watching this thing where people are overfishing tuna. You know, they were all making it so great now, all these big fancy boats. And well, I know that the tuna population is collapsing, which is an important keystone species, all this good stuff. And we have no way to stop that. We can't really change anything. We don't have an ethics, Aldo Leopold said, to even address that. And so we have been trying to figure out how we can convince people using our ethics and our morals, but that's talking to the wrong section. Now, the other thing that we have as a species is a culture. And if you study how culture works, it works through the transmission of ideas. Richard Dawkins wrote a book about it, you know, remember called The Selfish Gene, in which he basically says that the gene is out there trying to do and replicate and reproduce and survive out there. I think it's a little too broad of a paintbrush, but I can understand what he was saying. And so what we do as our species is we create cultures, and those cultures basically help feed or support or keep all that going, Dawkins said, right? And it's a meme. It's a type of way, when you study memetics, a type of way of transmitting information about how we do something, why we do something, and how to completely continue to survive with that. The problem is, once again, is that we can create cultural memes that are not attracted at all or attached in any way, shape, or form to the infrastructure as well. A guy named Damasio, who was an Italian neuroscientist, said that the reason why we are so desperately trying, of course, to create an infrastructure and to do all these things we need to do for economy is because of two things. We as a species need homeostasis. We need to make sure that we have food. We need to make sure that we have warmth. We need to make sure we have protections. That is our basic somatic response in the world. And we sometimes forget of our own biology, that we are beings who need those things. We need the assurity, as Abraham Maslow said, that these things get taken care of beforehand before we can even talk about the things that are more important to us. And we have that. But the second thing that we want to do is we want to flourish. We are not here just to feed ourselves and clothe ourselves. We want to continue to flourish and to grow, which is called teleonomics within biology. We want our place for our species to thrive and to grow and to continue to expand. And these two things drive us to seek out an infrastructure, to seek out these things, to address those kinds of things that we need just to feel like we have food on the table and a house to live in. And so much of our effort is satisfying just that. We go to work, we push our kids to get an education to get to work, we make sure we have housing, we make sure we have food on the table. All that stuff, those infrastructure things are still driven deep down by our own biology, our own need to make sure that we have food on the table, that we have the lights turned on, and that we're taken care of. And so we create structures just to make all that happen. And sometimes at the top of those things, we have our ethics, which we use to justify it and say why it's important. And we keep saying, well, you shouldn't be doing that. When we need to remember that at the basis of that is the sense of security of having food on the table and a house to live on. The problem is that we have created a society where we can have delivered everything to us by our cell phone. We have this fake illusion that we don't even have to leave the house anymore, that everything can be delivered to us, that we can live within a gated community, that we don't need other people and we're disconnected from those things, and none of that is true. We do need other people, and we do need those kind of connections and stuff like that. And I want to talk a little bit about Felix Adler, what makes him so unique as well. Adler, of course, was a young man. His father, a famous rabbi. You know his whole story. Of course, everybody in this room is probably pretty familiar with that. He was also heavily influenced not just by his dad, but by his mom. And his mom spent quite a great deal of time working as kind of what we'd like call the Hadassah at a local synagogue, of making sure that people were taken care of and that people who were sick were taken care of and all this kind of stuff. And I think she had a tremendously big role to play in his life. Adler's chief complaint with the religions of the day is he thought that they had it backwards. And if we had gone in the 1800s into a church, a Roman Catholic church, the priest would have his back to us. He'd be speaking in Latin. There may have been even a filigree screen here, right? Because you just separate the holy from the mundane that's out here. If we had gone into Presbyterian church, even up to the 1920s, they would have had a belief that some of you are going to heaven no matter what you do, and some of you are going to hell no matter what you do. And you could be a good person, but you're still going to go to hell, right? If we had gone into a synagogue at the time, women would have been behind that curtain back there or somewhere else. The service would have been in Hebrew, and we would have had this kind of focus just on the divine. And for Adler, there's something wrong with that. If the purpose of the religion is to affirm the worth and dignity of other people, why does it seem that the religions of his day were doing the complete opposite of that? Right? You're unworthy, you're broken, you're sinful, you will never, we can never trust you. We can only trust the divine, and everything we must do must get us to there, because it can't come from you people. Right? That was it. And Adler said, that's somehow backwards. We need to say that actually what divinity is resides somehow within the affirmation of the worth and dignity of the individual. That we could just say, oh, you fell short of the glory of God, Linda, you're not doing what you should be doing. But that's just to denigrate everything that Linda knows about the world, that she has touched, that she experienced, the way she cares for things, the knowledge she knows about those things. Adler went off to Europe to study to be a rabbi, because at the time there were no progressive, what we call now Reform synagogues in America. There were no rabbinic schools, so he went to Europe. That's what you did when you were a young progressive rabbi. That's where his father had come from. They're from Germany, Alsace. Adler himself was born there. He goes there and he encounters, Kantian speakers. Yeah, just a little bit of water, thank you. Oh, here's one, thank you, got it, thanks a lot. Shouldn't have had a bagel the first thing in the morning. Adler then gets to Europe, and luckily, he actually studies under some famous neo-Kantian philosophers. Just a little bit of background on Kant. Kant was actually responding to two other famous philosophers before him, Descartes and Hume, mostly to Hume. Here was Hume's problem. Hume's problem is, where do you get your ethics from? Right? So we as a modern progressive people may say, it is wrong to beat children, because we can look at the consequences of that when those children grow up, they either have low self-esteem or they'll beat their own children, and therefore it's wrong to beat children because we don't want that, right? And Hume says, yes, but still, why is it wrong to beat children? Oh, because we don't want them to turn out that way. Well, why don't you want them to turn out that way? What for Hume, the biggest problem is that just because something is doesn't mean that it ought to be, as we say in his philosophy. And that if you walk into a room, you could see a guy stand there with a knife, you could see the guy laying on the ground and a pool of blood dripping off in there. You see what happens. You see the consequences of the actions. But what you don't see is, tell me why it's wrong. Oh, because he murdered someone. But why is it wrong? You still don't have a philosophical basis, Hume said, for saying why something is. You're bringing that somehow. We know it feels wrong to us. And so therefore, why are we even using the power of our mind and reasoning? All we should do is just foster moral sentiment. It feels wrong. That should be enough, right? Hume says, let's build that up so when people look at something, they do feel moral repulsion. When we're looking at pictures of the border and seeing a young woman run off dragging two little kids who don't even have shoes on their feet, and we go, there's something wrong with that. That should be enough, according to Hume. That should be enough. We don't have to reason explain, because every time we get into reason explaining, as we see in this country, it leads nowhere. We should just look at that and feel repulsed to see a child treated that way at our border and say that that was enough. Now, Kant, of course, wanted to rescue reason to a certain extent. And what Kant basically says, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, is that the reason why we even notice those things, the reason why when we look at something and go, that was bad, that was wrong, is because the universe somehow has shaped our mind to pay attention to it. Otherwise, it would be noise. How is it that we even process those things and feel that that is wrong? That somehow the universe made us this way. It's a very somewhat Aristotelian view, because Aristotle had the same problem. How do we notice shapes and differences of colors? And according to Aristotle, it's almost like we have boxes inside our head for different things and categories that we put things into. And Kant has a kind of a similar but more complex way than Aristotle, that we pay attention to something because the universe has somehow shaped us this way. Now, he then says that there is something out there, these transcendentals, absolute, the universe must be somehow made where we as a species can look at things and say wrong, and that's how it shaped our brains, and that's why we notice those things. And for Kant, the answer then is just to act as if it's true, because actually you will never know it, Kant said. We can never lift the veils, keep trying to get to the wisdom and look firsthand on those eternal truths. We will never know the Dikhanzing, the thing in itself. The only thing we can know is basically our own reality-producing functions in the mind, our own reasoning and things like that. And so what Kant says is just act as if it were true, right? Because your brain is shaped that way, or maybe it's shaped that way for the reason, so let's use reason to figure out how we should live. Immanuel Kant dies, he influences a bunch of philosophers, and one of them was Felix Adler. Adler's listening to his teachers talk about these things, and he goes, that's really interesting. Very, 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 very interesting. Can someone alone sitting in a closet think up the universe, though, he thought? He thought, no, that there's something wrong with that. In fact, one of his tutors, a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson had a big impact on Felix Adler. Adler dedicates a whole chapter in his book to Emerson. He names his first child Waldo. Felix Adler's first child was Waldo. And at that time, what Emerson is basically saying is that you have all these things that are stopping you from being good people. Therefore, you just need to liberate yourself. Get rid of those old, stupid ideas that we have about how society is going to be, and just liberate yourself to be your own best selves. And he creates across the United States things called self-culture halls, where people could go and have the freedom to believe and think as they choose. Unitarianism kind of to this day. And Adler's listening to this, and he goes, wow, freedom to think to myself, well, I could be a jerk and be my own self too. And Adler thought that we could never just do that alone, that we needed to be part of other people, that we needed somehow not to have a self-culture, but an ethical culture that was dependent upon us listening to the ideas of other people, of engaging in other people. All of my mentors in my life who have come to me and said, Curt, you did pretty good, but actually here's something else you could have done as well. Here's something that you could do. Here's some more reading or education that you might need, and here's just how to reflect with us on the impact that you're having on other people. And so Adler decided that he's going to found what's called an ethical culture. That somehow all of this universal out there of what it is to be good and how we should think and how we should live is somehow dependent on every person in this room. We sometimes use the Buddhist parable, the ancient Hindu parable of the blind man and the elephant, right? They bring an elephant into a bunch of blind people touch it. They each touch a different part of it and then go of the elephant, sometimes the ear, the leg, and they all come out with radically different experiences. This is what an elephant is. And if we just say, oh, I'm sorry, all the women cannot tell us what they saw, and all the people who are not people, white people, you're excluded, we're going to have a very funny elephant that we're trying to put together. Instead, he says that's what we do all the time to people. We say to people, I have the truth. I don't have to listen to y'all anymore. Your opinions don't answer. Maybe we've always all have touched something much bigger than that. And really, instead, what we need to do is to come together and say, what do you know? What have you experienced? What new insights do you have? That we're going to create places, we're not going to call them synagogues or churches because people will think that's only one kind of person who touched the elephant. I'm not the rabbi or the minister because that's an example of that. We're not going to have Sunday morning services, we're going to have platforms. We're going to use all these kind of terms that were radically different. But a place where we could come together with people who have touched the stuff of life, each of you too, and experienced it and share what you know of the world. That's what Adler wanted to do. Adler adds one more piece to that, that we would then make sure that everybody has a chance to do that, right? That everybody should be there. He knew in his day that some people didn't even have a job, so he creates job training programs. He knows that some people were sick, so he creates the Visiting Nurse Service of New York, working obviously with other people. I'm talking about ethical culture in general. That there wasn't even affordable housing, so he built housing units in Manhattan that still exist to this day. That people were just sick and tired of work and all the horrors, and so he created places where we could go off into the mountains at Hudson Guild Farm and do all these things. And you build institutions not to tell people how to live, but give them the ability to renew, get refreshed, get educated, and return back together and says, this is the stuff of life. Because he thought you all had touched that big vision and that we needed to create a place where we could come to hear that. So here's an interesting question for me as a scientist, someone trained as a scientist. Do emergent ethical systems work? Because what he's suggesting there is not a set of beliefs. Adler never did pose a set of beliefs. What Adler posed was a series of practices. We need to have deeds before creeds, that we need just to create the spaces for all humanity to participate in it. And he does one other thing. We often say an ethical culture is not a prescriptive belief system. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I am only going to give you the tools to help you in your own life touch that in relationship with other people and come back. And he adds the other piece to that is that each of us has the ability to know something about life, where we're from, our backgrounds, our experiences, the tragedies that we went through, the loves, the hopes, the joys. We all know what life is. We know what adds to it. We could build an ethical system of that. All we need to do is create a space for ethics to be generative, that it comes out of that experience, not something that's just prescriptive saying, okay, I've all figured it out, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the book today. Memorize how the world is and how we should be. He gets rid of that whole approach. I'm not going to give you a prescriptive ethical system. I'm going to give you a pathway, all of us. He was a very young man at the time, working without anyone in the world who had ever done this, is say that we could generate our own ethical beliefs. Radically different, wonderful, revolutionary in so many respects. So it brings me to this last piece of why I'm an ethical biocentrist. I think to a certain extent we've moved radically away from Adler's approach. I think we have to think about the systems that we are in and how we can advance them. You know, when the creationists look at the universe, they say there must be a God. And the reason why there's God is because of the second law of thermodynamics, that everything in life should be trending towards chaos. But instead, we see more and more complex systems arising. And so that they say that's actually against the law of physics. We now know that that's actually not against the law of physics, but we didn't have supercomputers. Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, looked at the way humans interacted with one another. He says, how is it possible that just through basic little exchanges of monetary give and take in a market, that we could generate huge amounts of wealth? He says something is emerging as well. It's going the opposite direction, which he called the invisible hand. Some people think he meant the invisible hand of God. He never said that. He said there's something driving an economy that allows people to generate more wealth than there was before. Something has changed, right? Even Karl Marx looked at history and said, how is it possible that we should be going in this direction, and yet we see that even when we provide people with basic substance stuff, they're moving in this direction. He called it the dialectical materialism. We're moving greater and greater, and perhaps we can even control that, he mistakenly thought, by just giving everybody what they needed, and eventually we're going to rise to some utopian society. All of them saw that somehow we are bucking the trends of reality. And it really wasn't until recently, within the last 20 years, that we finally developed the supercomputers, the mathematics called complexity theory and chaos theory, to finally understand that actually, no, there's something about the dynamics, the way the universe operates as it is, that allows 1 + 1 + 1 to lead to 5. And it doesn't make sense. It's non-Newtonian, it's non-linear, but the mathematic proves once again that systems are emergent and that systems can produce more complexity, more sustainability, and more resiliency than even the component parts would afford. We've only just had the math to do that. Think of that. After the entire human history, we could finally say that there is something about the way that the universe operates. People often think that in natural selection or in evolution that there must be this natural selector that's out there selecting who should survive and not, rather than thinking of it, as biologists say, as a dynamic system, that it's something about the laws themselves and the way they operate that allows for natural selection to occur, for evolution to move forward, for complexity to emerge, and for ecosystems to get bigger. And the 5 things they say, those biologists and those mathematicians, is there has to be autonomy in the system. There has to be communication amongst the various component parts. That there has to be inclusion into that system of all the parts. Think of this poem about how a meadow works and all the various pieces of that. Right? That there has to be the law of requisite variety, that you can't have everything the same. There has to be diversity within that organism. And there has to be reciprocity. What brought me back out of environmental science and returned me to the pulpit here that I am today is that a revolutionary young man named Felix Adler came up with similar ideas for probably very different reasons. But we have a system of that today within ethical culture which affirms the same kind of thing, that we are free to believe what we choose, and we encourage others to do the same, what Adler called that organic organicity, that we believe in communication and sharing stories and narratives and listening to other people and advancing those things in the greater population, that we believe in the law of variety, that we are not to be the same. Adler thought that each one of you is unique. I don't want you to be like me or think like me.
Want anything? Did you bring anything?
The universe, and to add those things as well. And finally, that law of reciprocity, that has something special to offer, a unique gift, something that makes us want to interact with other people, and that's what we need to affirm as well. Adler's philosophy was spot on for how we can have a dynamical, ethical, biocentric, generative ethical system that focuses on the infrastructure and on the social structures and the things that have to happen to allow us to flourish as humans, to survive as humans, and to sustain ourselves and to sustain the world. The one thing Adler didn't do, which is the reason why I don't just call this ethical culture, I call it biocentrism, is that the rest of nature has to be included in this process as well. They too know something about the world. They too have been here for 1 billion years, 4.2 billion years on this planet, also knowing to survive. And that our whole system of advancement has to include those pieces as well. There's no way to go into the entire philosophy of ethical biocentrism in this setting. I just wanted to give you a small taste of it and why it's so good that we're participating in that conversation to this day. Thank you so much.